In the late 19th century, Russian confidence, bullishness even, was rising fast. It was not long before attention turned to having the Black Sea clauses of the Treaty of Paris rescinded. One after another, chancelleries across Europe were quietly canvassed for support for revising the treaty in general and removing the relevant clauses in particular. Most presented little opposition. There was one exception, however. London. In the winter of 1870, a copy of the circular outlining a proposal to drop the clauses that had been presented to the British cabinet was leaked to the press in St. Petersburg, of course in Russia, along with the news that it had been flatly rejected in London. Prince Gorchakov's efforts to force the matter went down well in Russia. They were met with howls of fury in the British press. The line taken by the Spectator was typical of the shocked indignation. Russia's attempt to renegotiate was diabolical. It declared a more daring and open defiance of European law, of international morality, of British policy, than the Russian note was never uttered to the world. The proposal to drop the clauses convinced some that war was imminent and that Britain had no choice but to use force to maintain the restrictions on Russia. This reaction was monstrous, wrote John Stuart Mill in a letter to The Times. The moves might be provocative, but they should not lead to military conflict. Even Queen Victoria agreed, sending a telegram to her Foreign Secretary, Lord Granville. Could any hint be given to the leading journals, she wrote, to refrain from rousing the war spirit here? The high levels of anxiety were triggered not so much by concerns about the Black Sea as by the general worry about Russia flexing increasingly strong muscles. With military action an unrealistic possibility, and faced with a poor hand of cards, Britain had little choice but to concede, prompting acerbic changes between the Prime Minister William Gladstone and the charismatic Benjamin Disraeli in the House of Commons. Russia got what it wanted, namely the freedom to do as it chose along the littoral and to station warships in the ports of the Crimea and elsewhere on the northern shore of the Black Sea. This was met with euphoria in St. Petersburg, according to one British eyewitness, and was presented as a triumph for Russia. Tsar Alexander II, who was said to be personally overjoyed, ordered the Te Deum to be sung in the chapel of the Winter Palace before playing at the Cathedral of St. Peter and Paul for some time with signs of deep emotion. Britain had been powerless to translate its economic power into diplomatic and political success. New approaches were soon adopted. One of the topics that came up for discussion was that of the title of the British ruler. Given the size and distribution of the dominions, regions, peoples, and places that were subject to the British sovereign, it was proposed that the monarch should be upgraded from a royal to an imperial title. This cosmetic change provoked fierce debate in the House of Parliament, with traditionalists appalled by the idea of changing ranks, titles and names that had held good for centuries. Kings had supreme authority over subordinate rulers. Lord Granville told the House of Lords there was no reason or justification for upgrading the sovereign's title. My lords, he declared, in regard of the dignity of Her Majesty herself, no name can appeal to the imagination so forcibly as that of Victoria, Queen of Great Britain and Ireland. This was how the monarch should be known. The problem was Russia and the Tsar. Apart from harking back to imperial Rome, the word Tsar is a simple contraction of Caesar. The Tsar's formal title in all its glory, when used in official correspondence and on formal occasions, made reference to an elaborate and lengthy list of the territories that he lorded over. In the mid-1870s, Disraeli, now Prime Minister, stressed to Parliament that a higher title than Queen should help give confidence to the population of India, already concerned about the Russian advance into Central Asia. Queen Victoria agreed with the principle, writing to Disraeli to say that attacking Russia from India is the right way and that an upgraded title might help focus the loyalty of her subjects in India. Some MPs were unconvinced of the need to compete in this way. Surely we British, who have ruled India for 100 years, said one parliamentarian, are not so unsure of ourselves that we need to alter the title of the Queen, solely in order that our sovereign may be placed on terms of equality with the Emperor of Russia. Others, however, stressed the dramatic change in the situation in the East, defiantly proclaiming that the British hold over Hindustan is intended to endure, and that therefore no part of that territory must be ceded. That Russia's frontiers were now only a few days' march from those of Her Majesty's dominions in India was a cause for alarm. After heated debate in Parliament, the bill was passed in 1876, proclaiming that Victoria was not only a queen, as she had been crowned nearly 4 decades earlier, but an empress as well. She liked it. At Christmas, she sent Disraeli a card signed Victoria, Regina et Imperatrix, Victoria, Queen and Empress. Seemingly superficial steps like this were accompanied by more practical measures in an increasingly tense environment, as the British constantly fretted about losing ground to their rivals. Both Britain and Russia became obsessed with setting up networks to spy on each other, to win over the local population, and to cultivate those with influence. Colonel Maclean of the Punjab Cavalry and the Indian Political Service was one of those deputed to monitor events in the borderlands between Persia, India, and Afghanistan in the 1880s. He established groups of merchants and operators of local telegraph exchanges and incentivized them to pass on information about what was going on in the region. Maclean homed in on Muslim clerics, providing them with gifts of shawls, carpets, cigars, and even diamond rings in order to impress the local population with the benefits of cooperating with Britain. Maclean justified these bribes as a way of channeling support to influential friends. In fact, they served to strengthen religious authority across a fractious region that was the focus of intense competition from outside. From the British point of view, there was real concern about Russia's intentions and capabilities, and about the threat that its expansion in Central Asia posed to the defenses of India. Talk in London turned to military confrontation with Russia, with Disraeli advising the Queen to be ready to authorize British troops to be sent to the Persian Gulf, and that the Empress of India should order her armies to clear Central Asia of the Muscovites and drive them into the Caspian. So nervy were the authorities that the Viceroy, Lord Lytton, ordered not one but 2 invasions of Afghanistan in 1878 through 1880, installing a puppet ruler on the throne in Kabul. Persia was assiduously courted and persuaded to sign the Herat Convention, in which it committed to protect Central Asia against Russian advance. This was no easy task, as Persia had its own interest in this region, and it was nursing bruises following the recent and unhelpful British intervention that had favored Afghanistan at its expense. In the meantime, steps were taken to build up contracts beyond Kandahar in order to have better early warning systems for any Russian initiative, military or otherwise. Considerable energy was expended by senior officers in assessing how to deal with a possible Russian invasion of the Raj. From the late 1870s, a series of reports were prepared that looked at the question from broad strategic perspective. It was recognized that disagreements and tensions with Russia and other theaters could, and probably would, have an impact in the East. One memorandum looked at the measures which should be adopted in India in the event of England joining Turkey in the war against Russia, following the Russian invasion of the Balkans in 1877. Another, written in 1883, asked, "Is an invasion of India by Russia possible?" And another, not long after that, "What are Russia's vulnerable points, and how have recent events affected our frontier policy in India?" A sign of how serious these were taken is clear from the appointment of their author, the hawkish General Sir Frederick, later Lord Roberts, as Commander-in-Chief of India in 1885. Not everyone shared this bleak view of the situation in Asia, even after a set of invasion plans prepared by General Alexei Kuropatkin had been acquired by the British in 1886. Henry Brackenbury, Director of Military Intelligence, felt that the Russian threat was being exaggerated in terms of Russia's willingness to attack and in terms of the readiness of the Tsar's army to do so. George Curzon, then a promising young MP and prize fellow of All Souls, but within a decade Viceroy of India, was even more dismissive. He saw no master plan or grand strategy behind Russia's interest in the East, far from being consistent or remorseless or profound. He wrote in 1889, "I believe it to be a hand-to-mouth policy, a policy of waiting upon events, of profiting by the blunders of others, and as often is the case committing such herself." It was certainly true that there was much bluster and wishful thinking in Russian attitudes to the big picture in Central Asia, and regarding India in particular. There were hotheads within the military who talked of grandiose schemes of replacing Britain as the dominant power in the subcontinent, while steps were also taken which seemed to suggest that Russia's interest was far from passive. For example, officers were sent on courses to teach them Hindi in preparation for imminent intervention in India. There was encouragement too, much as from Maharaja Duleep Singh of Punjab, who wrote to Tsar Alexander III promising to deliver some 250 million of my countrymen from the cruel yoke of the British rule, and claiming to speak for most of the powerful princes of India, seemingly an open invitation for Russia to expand its frontiers further south. In practice, however, things were not quite so simple. For one thing, Russia was already struggling with the thorny issue of how to incorporate the vast new regions that had recently been brought within the imperial orbit. Officials sent to Turkestan grappled with land registries that were complex and often contradictory, and their attempts to streamline local taxes and laws met with inevitable opposition. Then there were the gloomy realities engendered by public opinion, which gave rise to what the Council of Ministers in St. Petersburg called the fanatical mood on our eastern borderlands, resulting from the influence of Islam in almost every aspect of day-to-day life on the new Russians, who were now part of the Tsar's empire. The worry about insurrection and rebellion in these freshly added territories was so great that mandatory military service was waived in these regions, and financial demands were kept deliberately low. Russian peasants, as one leading intellectual noted acidly, did not enjoy such generous treatment. Complications also arose from views about the local populations. Russian critics drew attention to Britain's deeply prejudiced attitudes, observing that British soldiers treated traders in the bazaars in Tashkent as something nearer to animals than men. On one occasion, the wife of a British captain apparently refused to let the Maharaja of Kashmir escort her into dinner, claiming he was a dirty Hindu. For all their criticisms, however, Russian attitudes were no more enlightened. Tsarist officers may have complained to each other about how the British treated the locals, but there was little evidence to show that they truly saw things differently. All Hindus without exception, wrote one 19th century Russian visitor to India, devote all their skill and all their soul to the most horrible usury. Woe betide the unhappy native who was seduced by their deceitful promises. Nevertheless, there was a frisson of excitement about the new worlds Russia was coming into contact with. As the Minister of the Interior articulated in his diary in 1865, Tashkent has been taken by General Cherniev, he wrote. Nobody knows why or for what purpose, but there is something ironic in all that we are doing on the far frontiers of our empire. The extension of the borders was marvelous, he wrote. First Russia reached the river Amur, then the Ussuri, and now Tashkent. And yet, despite the teething problems, Russia's influence and involvement in the East continued to expand at accelerating speed as it developed its own Silk Roads. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway and the connection with the Chinese Eastern Railway led to an immediate boom in trade, with volumes nearly trebling between 1895 and 1914. This was supported by new entities like the Russo-Chinese Bank, set up to finance economic expansion in the Far East. As the Russian Prime Minister Stolypin told Duma, the Russian Parliament, in 1908, Russia's East was a region pregnant with prospects and resources. Our distant and inhospitable frontier territory is rich in gold, wood, furs, and immense spaces suitable for agriculture. Although sparsely populated now, he warned, these spaces would not remain empty for long. Russia needed to seize the opportunities currently open to it. This was hardly reassuring from Britain's point of view, given how jealously its position in the Far East had been guarded. Opening up markets in China in particular had proved difficult. In 1793, for example, the first British mission had been dealt with loftily by the Qianlong court after asking for the right to establish a trading community. China's connections penetrated deep into every country under heaven. As such, the British request was hardly unexpected, noted a letter from the Emperor that was brought back to King George III. As your ambassador can see for himself, the author went on dismissively, we possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures. In fact, this was bluster, for in due course terms were agreed. The aggressive response was rather based on the acute awareness that Britain's tentacles were extending even further, and that attack was the best form of defense. As it happened, initial Chinese suspicions were not far off the mark, for once trading privileges were given, Britain had little hesitation in using force to preserve and extend its position. Central to the commercial expansion was the sale of opium, despite fierce protest by the Chinese, whose outrage at the devastating effects of drug addiction was shrugged off by the British authorities. The opium trade had expanded in a major way following the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, which opened up access to ports where the trade had been restricted previously, while also ceding Hong Kong to the British. Further concessions were granted after British and French forces marched on Beijing in 1860, looting and burning the old Summer Palace. Some saw this as a seminal moment that marked yet another chapter in the triumph of the West. This has been the destiny of England, ran one report in the British press, to break down a government fabric which has long mystified the European world, and to uncover to its own subjects its hollowness and its evils. Another commentator was equally blunt. The mysterious and exclusive barbarism of the Chinese Empire, he wrote, had been dismantled by the force of active and intrusive Western civilization. As Britain sought to counter the continuing emergence of Russia in the Far East, the decision was taken in 1885 to occupy the islands of Komodo off the southern coast of the Korean Peninsula as a base, the cabinet was told, for the blockade of the Russian force in the Pacific, and also as an advanced station to support operations against Vladivostok. This was a move aimed at protecting Britain's strategic position and above all its trade with China, if necessary with a preemptive strike. In 1894, before the railways had opened up new possibilities, more than 80% of all customs revenue collected in China was paid by Britain and by British companies, whose ships also carried more than 4/5 of China's total trade. It was obvious that Russia's rise and that of the new land routes that would bring produce to Europe would come at Britain's expense. It was in this context of increasing rivalry and tension that it became known at the end of the 1890s that Russia had begun to take steps to woo Persia. This raised the prospect of an alliance that might pose a threat to the northwestern approach to India. In London, it had previously been conceded, albeit after much deliberation, that pressure on the subcontinent from Russia via Afghanistan through the Hindu Kush was likely to be limited. For strategists armed with pencils and maps, plotting a route from Central Asia through this geographically challenging region looked easy, but it was recognized that, while a surprise small-scale assault could not be discounted, the reality was that the terrain minimized a major military effort through mountain passes that were well known for being treacherous and extremely difficult to penetrate. The approach through Persia was another matter. Russia had become increasingly active on its southern flank, occupying Merv in 1884, in a move that caught British officials and agents by surprise. They first learned about it from newspaper reports and wooing the leadership in Tehran. With Russia's frontier now less than 200 miles from Herat, the road to Kandahar, and therefore India, was wide open. More worrying still was the expansion that had been followed up with infrastructure projects to connect new regions to the Russian heartlands. In 1880, construction started on the Trans-Caspian Railway, with a line soon connecting through to Samarkand and Tashkent, and by 1899 a spur connected to Merv and Kush, with striking distance of Herat. These railway lines were not just symbolic, they were arteries that would allow provisions, weapons, soldiers to be delivered to the British Empire's back door. As Field Marshal Lord Roberts emphasized to the officers of the Eastern Command not long afterwards, it was regrettable that the railways had been extended so far. Now, however, a line had been established over which Russia could not be allowed to cross. If it did, he stated, it would be a considerable casus belli, that is, grounds for war. The railway lines also represented an economic threat. In 1900, the British Embassy in St. Petersburg forwarded to London a summary of a pamphlet that had been written by a Russian officer advocating the extension of track into Persia and Afghanistan. It was likely the officer admitted that the British would not react well to the new transport system, but this was no surprise. After all, a railway connection that expanded Asia would place the whole trade of India and Eastern Asia with Russia and Europe in Russian hands. This was something of an exaggeration, however, as one senior diplomat observed in reply to this report. The strategical considerations put forward by the author are of no great value, wrote Charles Hardinge, because it would be madness for Russia to make a move on this region, given Britain's control of the Persian Gulf. Nevertheless, at a time when British anxieties were already heightened, such murmurs about Russia's commercial reach extending in this direction provided yet another cause for concern. As it was, phantoms and plots were being seen at every corner, and dutifully recorded by anxious British diplomats. Awkward questions were asked about why the presence of a certain Dr. Paszewski in Polishir had not been spotted more quickly, together with updates on whether his claims to be treating plague victims were really true. The visit of a Russian nobleman identified as Prince Dabija was likewise viewed with extreme suspicion, and the fact that he seemed to be very reticent about his movements and intentions, duly noted and passed on. In London, Russia moved to the top of the agenda of cabinet meetings, drew the attention of the Prime Minister himself, and became one of the Foreign Office's top priorities. In the short term, Persia was the arena where competition was most intense. The rulers of Persia had grown fat on generous soft loans provided by those seeking to build good relations with a nation that was blessed with an inviolable strategic location as the fulcrum between East and West. Britain had carefully satisfied the prodigal whims and financial appetites of Persia's rulers in the late 19th century, until in 1898 the extravagantly mustachioed Shah Mozaffar ad-Din dropped a bombshell rejecting a proposed new loan of 2 million euros. A high-ranking official was immediately dispatched to find out more, but was stonewalled. Lord Salisbury, the British Prime Minister, followed the situation personally, issuing instructions to the Treasury to soften the conditions and increase the quantum of the proposed facility. Rumors about what was going on behind the scenes began to circulate. Finally, it emerged that Russia was offering to lend a much higher amount than Britain was willing to lend, and on much better terms. This was smart maneuvering by St. Petersburg. Tax revenues in Russia were rising sharply, while foreign investment was also beginning to flood in from outside. Slowly but surely, a middle class was starting to emerge. Men like Lopukhin in Chekhov's Cherry Orchard, who a generation earlier would have been tied to the land, were taking advantage of social change, new domestic markets, and new export opportunities to make fortunes for themselves. Economic historians like to highlight growth by noting sharp rises in urbanization, in pig iron production, and in the amount of new railway track being laid down. But one need look only as far as the literature, art, dance, and music of this period, the blossoming of Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky, and many others to get a sense of what was happening. Culturally and economically, Russia was booming, increasingly buoyant. It was inevitable that Russia would make overtures to Persia by feeding its insatiable hunger for cash, which stemmed in part from the structural inefficiencies of the administration and in part from the expensive taste of its ruling classes. After Sir Mortimer Durand and the British minister in Tehran had reported back with information gathered from Austrian sources in Constantinople in early 1900 that revealed the Tsar's government was willing to lend money and effectively outbid Britain, all hell broke loose in London. Committees were set up to look at extending the railway from Quetta to Sistan and to build a network of telegraph lines to save southern Persia, as Lord Curzon wrote, from falling into Russia's grasp. Radical proposals were suggested to counter Russia's perceived advance, including undertaking major irrigation works in the Sistan region as a way of cultivating the land and building ties locally. There was even talk of the British seeking a lease of land in Helmand province, so that routes through India could be protected effectively. By now it was thought to be a question of when, and not if, Russia would attack. As Lord Curzon put it in 1901, we wanted buffer states between ourselves and Russia. One by one, each of these had been crushed out of existence. China, Turkestan, Afghanistan, and now Persia had been lifted off the board. The buffer, he added, has been reduced to the thinness of a wafer. Lord Salisbury was desperate, urging his Foreign Secretary, Lord Landsdorne, to find a way to lend money to Persia. The situation seemed hopeless, the Prime Minister wrote in October 1901 to his Foreign Secretary, Lord Lansdowne. The Treasury was reluctant to improve its offer, alarmed by how quickly the Shah and his entourage worked their way through substantial sums. Options were running out. If the money is not found, the Prime Minister wrote, Russia will establish a practical protectorate in Persia, and we can only by force save the Gulf ports from falling into it. Fear of just that happening had surfaced the previous year when it was reported that Russia was preparing to take control of the port of Bandar Abbas, a strategically vital location controlling the Straits of Hormuz, the narrowest point in the Persian Gulf. As one alarmed peer told the House of Lords, the presence of a naval arsenal in the Persian Gulf in the hands of a great power could be a menace, not only to our trade with India and China, but also to that of Australia. As British warships were ordered to take countermeasures in the event of any move by the Russians, Lord Lansdowne was adamant. We should regard the establishment of a naval base or of a fortified port in the Persian Gulf by another power as a very grave menace to British interests. The consequences, he said, would be serious. He meant war. Russian ghosts were everywhere. Anxious Foreign Office officials pored over a stream of reports on the activity of Tsarist officers, engineers, and surveyors in Persia that were flooding back to London. The significance of a new Russian-backed trading company operating between Odessa on the Black Sea and Bushire on the southern coast of Persia was earnestly discussed in Parliament, while MPs were alarmed by confident reports that shadowy figures who claimed to be spotting birds, butterflies, and other animalculae were in fact Russian agents distributing rifles to tribesmen in contentious border regions and stirring up discontent. The situation attracted the attention of King Edward VII, who wrote to the Foreign Secretary in 1901 stating his concern that Russian influence seems daily preponderating in Persia to the detriment of England, and urging him to tell the Shah that failure to stand up to the Russians would not be tolerated. It counted for little that the British minister in Tehran, Sir Cecil Springrice, purported that the Shah swore blind that he does not intend to take up position in Persia, which would facilitate the invasion of India. Anxiety mounted to a time when there was an acute sense of imperial overstretch, confrontation with the Boers in southern Africa, and the Yihechuan uprising, better known as the Boxer Rebellion, in China, drove home the idea that Britain was at risk of being overwhelmed overseas, further exasperating fears of Russian advance. A doom-laden report presented to the cabinet in London at the end of 1901 stated that the Russians would be able to deliver 200,000 men into Central Asia, and more than half that number uncomfortably close to the Indian border, once the railway line was extended from Orenburg to Tashkent. This came hot on the heels of reports from Batumi in Georgia that the Russians were about to transfer 20,000 men to Central Asia, a false alarm, as it turned out. The problem was that from Britain's point of view, the options seemed limited. The cost of reinforcing the frontier was ruinous, calculated a few years later to be no less than 20 million euros, plus a rolling annual cost. Violent scenes on the streets of St. Petersburg in 1905 and the catastrophic defeat of the Tsar's navy in the Russo-Japanese War provided small comfort to those who thought it was only a matter of time before Russia broke its shackles. Britain could ill afford to resist what was openly referred to as the menacing advance of Russia. Other solutions were needed to stop a bad situation from becoming worse. Perhaps one paper prepared by military intelligence suggested it was time to agree terms with Germany to concentrate Russian mines. In London, talk turned to the possibility of a British military intervention in Mesopotamia, part of the now constant preoccupation with shoring up Britain's presence across the Middle East. The Committee for Imperial Defense reviewed the possibility of occupying Basra, while there was exciting discussion about dismembering Asiatic Turkey to gain access to the rich fields of the Euphrates. Then there were proposals in 1906 for a railway line to be built from the Persian Gulf to Mosul, which, among other benefits, would allow British troops to be delivered to Russia's soft underbelly in the Caucasus. One by one, these were dismissed on the grounds of practicality and cost. As Sir Edward Grey, the new Foreign Secretary, warned, the cost of an invasion and of securing and defending new frontiers would run into the millions. Grey had another idea. Britain's position in the east was limited and dangerously exposed. But what was needed was the reorientation of Russia's focus away from this region altogether. In a bold statement given to the Times just a month before his appointment at the end of 1905, he made it clear that there would be much to gain if an understanding could be reached about our Asiatic possessions. No British government, he said, would make it its business to thwart or obstruct Russia's policy in Europe. It was urgently desirable, therefore, that Russia's position and influence should be expanded in Europe and diverted, in other words, from Asia. The timing could not have been better. France was becoming increasingly agitated about the burgeoning economic growth of Germany, its neighbor and bitter rival. Memories of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, which had led to the siege of Paris and a Prussian victory parade through the center of the city following the agreement of an armistice, were still fresh in the mind. The speed of that invasion had been a great shock, prompting fears that another lightning strike might catch France unawares again, especially since one of the effects of the attack had been the unification of Germany into an empire proclaimed in the Palace of Versailles itself. This was bad enough. The French were deeply alarmed by the surging rise in German industry in the 2 decades after 1870, as coal production doubled and metal production trebled. The upswing in the economy led to greater and greater investment in an already impressive military machine on both land and sea. French diplomats worked furiously behind the scenes in the early 1890s to conclude a military convention and then a full-blown alliance with Russia, the primary purpose of which was self-defense. Both countries agreed to attack Germany in the event that the latter, Germany, or its allies, mobilized their armies, and indeed both gave formal undertakings to act against Britain in the event that London moved against either.